This story was sent in by a viewer who has asked to remain anonymous. I was 28 years old, and the drive from Salt Lake City to Las Vegas was one I knew by heart. I'd done it maybe 15 times since I moved to Utah for work. My mum lived in a suburb south of Vegas, so a few times a year I'd make the trip, usually on a Friday after work, music up, coffee in the cup holder, just me and 5 hours of dark desert highway. I knew every exit. I knew where the gas stations were. I knew which rest stops had working bathrooms. I was comfortable on that road. That familiarity is part of why it took me as long as it did to trust what I was seeing. I left Salt Lake at 7 in the evening on a Thursday in late October. It was cold enough that I had the heat running, and the last of the sunset was already gone by the time I got past Orem. The sky was that deep, flat black you only get in the high desert. No moon. The highway was quiet, a few semis, the occasional set of headlights going the other direction, nothing that felt unusual. I put on a podcast, settled in, figured I'd be at my mum's place by midnight. The first hour passed without anything worth mentioning. I-15 south through central Utah is long and flat and unremarkable. And that night it was exactly that. I passed Santaquin around 8. I got into the open stretch past Nephi just before 9:20, and the road ahead was empty as far as the headlights reached. That's when I noticed the vehicle behind me. There was nothing unusual about having a car behind me. What was less normal was that it wasn't closing the gap. I was doing 78 miles an hour. The vehicle behind me was also doing 78 miles an hour, and it was holding exactly 7 or 8 car lengths back. Steady, even, like it was calibrated. I told myself it was someone on cruise control set to the same speed as me. A coincidence. I'd probably done the same thing to other drivers without realizing it. I switched lanes. The headlights switched lanes. I slowed to 70. The headlights slowed. I brought my speed back up to 78. The distance didn't change by a single car length. I couldn't make out what kind of vehicle it was. Just 2 high beams, white, level, not the elevated angle of a semi or a big truck. A car or maybe a small SUV. Dark-colored, but that was all I could tell. By 9:47, those headlights had been exactly that same distance behind me for close to 30 minutes. The road curved a few times through a low canyon pass south of Nephi, and on those curves I could see more of the vehicle in profile. It was definitely not a truck, too low for that. But every time the road straightened, it settled right back to that same gap. 7 car lengths. 8 at the most. Never more, never less. I thought about calling someone. My mum, my friend from work, anyone. But I couldn't figure out what I'd say. There's a car behind me. That's not a sentence that means anything. I reached for my phone to check the time, and I made myself look at it for only a second. 10:02. And when I glanced back up, the headlights were exactly where they'd been. That's when I made a decision. I was approaching the Nephi interchange. I flipped my blinker on and took the exit. The headlights did not follow. I pulled into a gas station on the frontage road, one of those small ones with the gravel lot and the overhead lighting that flickers a little. And I sat with the engine running and the heat on, and I watched the on-ramp. One car went past on the overpass, a semi going the other direction. Then nothing. I watched that on-ramp for 12 minutes by my dashboard clock. Not one vehicle pulled off. I got out, stretched my legs, went inside and used the bathroom. I bought a coffee I didn't really need. The woman behind the counter had the television on, some late local news, and she asked me where I was headed. I said Vegas. She told me to be careful. It gets icy on the highway this time of year. I thanked her and went back to my car. I got back on the highway. I told myself I'd imagined it. The next 25 miles were completely empty. I didn't check my rear view more than I normally would. By the time I saw the signs for Fillmore, I had nearly convinced myself I'd been tired and paranoid, and reading too much into two pieces of headlights at the same speed as me for 30 minutes. I decided I'd stop at the Fillmore rest area, use the bathroom again, and get back on the road with a clear head. I pulled in off the highway. The rest area was mostly empty at that hour. A semi, dark and silent, parked lengthwise across the far end. A blue minivan near the bathrooms with a child's seat visible through the rear window. And in the back row of the lot, parked alone, facing away from the highway, was a dark blue pickup truck. Lights off, engine off, positioned so that its headlights would face the scrub desert to the west rather than the road. I noticed the angle of it before I noticed anything else. It was deliberately turned away from the on-ramp, away from the highway lights, away from the fluorescent overheads above the bathrooms. Like whoever parked it chose that angle on purpose. I sat in my car. I hadn't seen a dark blue pickup truck on the highway. I didn't know what the vehicle behind me looked like, but I had taken a 12-minute detour off the highway in Nephi, and Fillmore was 62 miles south of that exit. I was bad at the math in the moment. I just sat there in my car looking at the truck and feeling something I couldn't name. I took a photo. I didn't get out. I took it through my windshield with my phone camera, maybe 50 feet away, zoomed in as much as I could. Then I put the car in drive and got back on the highway without stopping to use the bathroom. I made it to Mesquite, Nevada without pulling over once. I paid cash for a room at a casino hotel, went upstairs, locked the deadbolt and the chain, and sat on the bed with all the lights on. In the morning I looked at the photo. The image was grainy. Windshield glass, phone camera, bad lighting. It wasn't a good picture by any measure. But the truck was clearly visible. Dark blue, crew cab, Utah plates, though I could only make out the first 3 characters. 7 KP. The rest was too dark. And in the driver's seat there was a shape, a person, sitting very still, turned slightly toward the passenger side window, toward the direction I'd been standing when I took the photo. I had stood 50 feet from that truck for at least 2 full minutes. I had looked directly at it. I had not seen anyone in the cab. I called the Utah Highway Patrol non-emergency line. I gave them the photo, the partial plate, the location, the time. The officer I spoke to was patient and took all my information down. He said he'd pass it along and that I might hear back from a follow-up officer. I never heard back. My mum said I'd probably startled a trucker who was sleeping in his cab, and he'd just sat very still, hoping I wouldn't notice him. People do that, she said. They don't want to be bothered. That's a completely reasonable explanation. I've tried to hold on to it, but here's the number I keep coming back to. 62 miles. That's the distance between the Nephi exit and the Fillmore rest area. I sat at that gas station for 12 minutes. I drove those 62 miles at roughly 75 miles an hour. It took me about 50 minutes. So from the point I exited the highway to the point I arrived in Fillmore, 62 minutes total. If a vehicle was behind me when I exited in Nephi, a vehicle that did not follow me off, it would have needed to drive those 62 miles in under 50 minutes at a speed above 78 miles an hour, with no stops, and still arrive in Fillmore with enough lead time for the engine to cool completely. I'm not a physicist. Maybe I'm wrong about the cooling time. Maybe there's a stretch of road I don't know about where a truck could idle to cool down faster. Maybe the person in the driver's seat was sleeping and just shifted when my headlights swept over the cab, and I misread a shadow in a grainy photo for a face turned toward me. I've tried every version of that. None of them fully close. I don't drive that stretch of I-15 at night anymore. I leave in the morning now, even if it means traffic through Provo. My mum thinks I'm being overly cautious. Maybe I am. The next story was sent in by a viewer who has asked to remain anonymous. I'd been making the same solo fishing trip to western Montana for 4 years in a row. Same stretch of the Clark Fork River. Same small motel off Route 200. 8 rooms. A couple who ran it themselves. The kind of place where you sign a paper card and they hand you an actual key attached to a plastic diamond fob. I liked the predictability of it. I'd get the same room when it was available. Room 4, end of the building, closest to the footpath that led down to the water. I'd check in, change out of my driving clothes, and be standing in the river within 45 minutes of arriving. I showed up on a Friday in late May. I was 36. I'd driven up from Missoula that morning, got to the motel around 2 in the afternoon. The owner, I'd known him by first name for 3 years, a man in his 60s named Gerald, came out and handed me my key and said the river was running a little high from snowmelt, but the fishing had been good all week. I thanked him and took my bags to room 4. I dropped my duffel on the luggage rack. I set my laptop on the desk and plugged it in, left USB-C port, which charges a bit faster, a small habit I'd had for years. I angled the laptop parallel to the edge of the desk, which I always do without thinking about it, just a mild neatness thing. I unzipped the duffel about 3 inches on the left side. I always do this after packing to release tension on the zipper, and left it that way on the rack. I checked the window latch out of habit, locked from inside. I was out the door and on the footpath by 2:45. I fished until about 8:30 that evening. The river was running high the way Gerald had said, and the light was going flat, and I'd had a good day. I walked back up the footpath, rinsed my waders at the spigot by the path, and went back to room 4. The keycard worked fine. The door opened the way it always did. I set my gear down and went to the bathroom to wash my hands. That's when I noticed the first thing. The soap bar. I hadn't touched it. I'd showered at home that morning before the long drive up. I hadn't been in that bathroom at all since checking in. The soap bar in motel rooms always has that smooth, sealed look fresh out of the wrapper. Rectangular corners, clean edges, undisturbed surface. This one had been used. The edges were rounded. The surface had that slightly softened, matte look that soap only gets after at least one wash. I looked at the drain. There was a thin ring of reddish-brown sediment around the edge of the drain. Fine and even and uniform. Not rust. Rust would be patchy, irregular, darker in some spots than others. This was almost powdery. I crouched down and looked at it more closely. River-bottom soil, the kind that comes off your boots or your feet after wading, the kind that rinses down and settles in a ring around the drain. I'd seen it plenty of times in my own shower at home after fishing days. I had not been in that shower. I had washed my waders at the outdoor spigot. I had not gone near the bathroom before leaving for the river. I went back to the main room and looked at the duffel. The left zipper pull was fully closed, not 3 inches open the way I'd left it. I unzipped it and went through the contents one by one. My fishing gear was all there. My change of clothes, my toiletry bag, my wallet, which I'd left in the bag rather than taking it to the river. Everything present. Nothing missing. But the shirts were folded differently than how I pack. I always fold shirts backside out. These were front side out. I looked at the laptop. The charging cable was in the right USB-C port. I always use the left. The laptop was angled maybe 15 degrees off parallel with the edge of the desk. I stood in the middle of that room for a while without moving. The window was still latched from inside. The door had opened normally with my keycard. My key had been in my shirt pocket the entire day on the river. Nothing in the room was visually broken or disturbed. Everything was just slightly, carefully wrong. That night I told myself a list of explanations. Housekeeping had come in, and a staff member used the bathroom. I'd misremembered the zipper and the port and the laptop angle. The soap had already been partially used when I arrived, and I just hadn't noticed. I lay in bed with the lights off and went through each one. None of them fully held. In the morning, I went to the front desk and mentioned it to Gerald as casually as I could. I said housekeeping might have come in while I was out, which was fine, but I thought someone may have used the shower. I showed him the photo I'd taken of the drain. He frowned. He said housekeeping didn't go into occupied rooms unless they were called. He went into the back office to check the keycard log. The electronic door system recorded every entry, he said, with a timestamp. He came out a few minutes later. He said there were 2 log entries for room 4. The first was at 2:07 p.m. when I checked in. The second was at 4:55 p.m. I had been on the river by 2:45. I had not come back. Gerald said he had no second key for room 4. The keycard system didn't carry over between guests. Mine was freshly programmed when I checked in. He said he had no explanation for the 4:55 entry. He offered to pull up the parking lot security camera with me. They had one camera covering most of the lot. We went through the footage. At 4:51 p.m., a pale-colored pickup, silver or light grey, hard to say, pulled into the lot and parked close to the row of rooms. A figure got out. Male, I thought, though I couldn't be certain. Dark jacket, brimmed hat pulled low. The figure walked toward the rooms and out of the frame. At 5:04 p.m., the figure came back, got into the truck, and drove out of the lot. 13 minutes. The camera angle didn't cover the room doors. No plate was visible. The figure's face never appeared. Gerald called the county sheriff. A deputy came out that afternoon, took a report, photographed the drain and the keycard log printout. He said that because nothing was taken, it would be documented but wouldn't receive active follow-up. He was honest about that. He didn't seem dismissive. I remember he looked at the keycard log for a while without saying anything. But he was clear about what could realistically be done. I drove home the next morning. I'd planned to stay through Sunday. I've been back to that stretch of the Clark Fork twice since then, but I stay somewhere else now. Gerald handled everything right. It's not the motel itself that bothers me. It's the room, room 4, end of the building, closest to the footpath, most isolated from the office, the one you'd choose if you wanted to move through quickly and not be seen. What I keep returning to is the shower. Whoever was in that room had 13 minutes. They went through my duffel carefully enough that nothing was missing, but everything was subtly out of order. They moved my laptop and the charging cable. And at some point in those 13 minutes, they used the shower. I don't have an explanation for that detail. Of everything, the keycard log, the camera footage, the folded shirts, that's the one I can't set down. They were comfortable enough in my room to take a shower. I don't know who they were. I don't know how they had a key. I don't know what they were looking for, or whether they found it. The sheriff's department, as far as I know, never followed up. The next story was sent in by a viewer who has asked to remain anonymous. I was 23, and I was driving alone from Memphis to Louisville to visit a college friend. Early November, a Tuesday night. I'd left a little after 10:30 because I'd worked a long shift and gone home to pack, and just decided to push through the night rather than sleep and leave in the morning. My friend had left a key under her doormat. The drive was about 5.5 hours. I'd done it twice before, both times during the day, and I figured nighttime would just mean less traffic. For the first few hours, nothing was unusual. I'd taken a back route through western Kentucky to get around some construction that kept showing up on my maps along the main interstate. Two-lane highway, mostly empty at that hour, small towns spaced out 15 or 20 miles apart. I had music on. I had coffee from a travel mug that had gone lukewarm. I was tired, but not in any way that felt dangerous. Just after 1 in the morning, the low fuel light came on. I'd been planning to stop earlier and hadn't. My maps showed a gas station in a small town about 11 miles ahead. I kept going. The station I pulled into was on the edge of a town called Cadiz. 2 pumps under a flat aluminum canopy, old fluorescent overhead lights, a small attached store about the size of a walk-in closet. The kind of gas station that looks like it was built in the early 90s and not substantially updated since. The light above the nearer pump was flickering slowly, not fast enough to be dramatic, just enough that you noticed it. I got out of the car. The air was cold, mid-30s, sharp after the warmth of the drive. I wanted to pump fast and get moving. That's when I noticed the cars at the back of the lot. There were 2 of them, parked side by side at the far edge of the property, right up against the tree line. 70 or 80 feet from the pumps. No interior lights. One was a sedan, one was taller, an SUV or a truck cab, hard to tell at that distance in the dark. The SUV's exhaust was visible in the cold air, rising steadily, engine running. I figured they were employee vehicles. I didn't think much more about it and turned back to the pump. The card reader had a paper sign taped over it, cash only after 10 p.m. I had $42 in my wallet. I pumped the gas, went inside. There was one person in the store, a man behind the counter, mid-60s, heavy-set, grey hair, flannel shirt. He was looking down at something, a ledger or a printed sheet, when I walked in. He didn't look up when the door opened. I walked up to the counter and told him I needed to pay for pump 2. Without looking up, he said, "Room 7 is already paid for." I stopped. I was the only other person in the store. There was no one he could have been speaking to except me. I told him I wasn't checking in anywhere. I said I was just driving through and I needed to pay for the gas on pump 2, cash. He looked up. He looked at me for a moment, a full beat, maybe 2, and his expression was unreadable. Not unfriendly, not threatening, just flat. The way you'd look at a word in a sentence that doesn't fit the context. Then he said, "Oh, I thought you were with them." His eyes moved, just slightly, toward the back of the parking lot. Not a gesture, just a small shift in the direction of his gaze. I put the cash on the counter. I did not ask what he meant, though I wanted to. Something about the stillness of him, the way he hadn't moved, the way he'd said it without any inflection at all, like he was reading from a list, made me want to be out of that store before he said anything else. I had the feeling that asking a follow-up question would produce an answer that would make things worse rather than better. I said thank you, and I turned toward the door. As I pushed it open, he said, "You heading north?" I said yes. I don't know why I answered. The word was out before I thought about it. He said nothing else. I got in my car. My hands were unsteady when I reached for the ignition. I noticed it only when I had to correct twice for the key slot. I pulled out of my space and swung toward the exit, and as I turned, my headlights swept across the back of the parking lot. Both cars were still there. There were people in both of them. I could see them clearly for the half second that my headlights were on them. Shapes in the front seats of both cars. Faces, or the place where faces were, pale in the light, angled in my direction, watching me leave. The SUV's exhaust was still rising steadily. It had been running the whole time I was inside. In my rearview mirror, the man from the store was standing in the open doorway. watching me go. I drove 91 miles before I stopped. I counted on the odometer because I needed something concrete to focus on. I got off the interstate at the first major exit with a chain motel, pulled into the lot, parked directly under a light pole, and sat in my car for a while before I went in. I called my friend and told her I was stopping for the night. I didn't tell her why. I didn't know how to make it make sense out loud. Here's what I've thought about since. I had not said which direction I was heading. I'd told him I was passing through, paying for gas. I hadn't said north or south. I hadn't named a destination. And as I was walking out, he asked if I was heading north. Not east or west or south, north, which was correct. If he was guessing, if he was just making conversation, then north is a reasonable guess for a young woman driving alone on a rural highway at 1 a.m. North is toward the larger cities. North is where you'd go if you were going somewhere safer. I've tried to hold on to that. I looked up Cadiz, Kentucky when I got home. I found a gas station matching the description. No record of a motel or any rooms for rent at that address. No listing for a room 7 anywhere nearby that I could find. I looked at the satellite image for a while. Trees at the back of the lot. A strip of gravel. I couldn't tell anything from it. I don't know who the people in those cars were. I don't know what room 7 means, or whether it exists at that address, or whether it was meant for someone else who was expected at that hour on that road. The most reasonable explanation is that I arrived at the same time as someone else was expected, and he made a mistake, and the people in the cars were waiting for someone else for a reason that had nothing to do with me. I've run that version many times. It mostly holds. What I can't fit into it is the question as I was leaving. He had already corrected himself. The mistake, if it was a mistake, was over. There was no reason to ask where I was going. That question came after the explanation, not as part of it. I haven't driven that route at night since. I don't know that I will. The details we can't explain tend to be the small ones, not the dramatic moments, but the quiet question at the door, the mark in the drain, the truck parked facing the wrong way. Those are the ones that don't leave. I hope you're somewhere safe tonight. Anchors_used. Story 1. Trailing vehicle maintains exact 7-8 car length gap, regardless of narrator's speed or lane changes, for 30+ consecutive minutes. Story 1. Narrator detours for 12 minutes in Nephi. Vehicle does not follow. Dark blue truck is already parked and engine cold in Fillmore Rest Area 62 miles south when narrator arrives. Story 1. Truck parked facing away from highway and overhead lights toward the desert. Story 1. Photo shows a figure in the driver's seat. Narrator stood 50 feet from the cab for 2+ minutes and saw no one. Partial plate 7 KP. Story 2. Duffel zipper fully closed. Narrator always leaves it 3 inches open to relieve zipper tension. Story 2. Laptop charging cable in right USB-C port. Narrator always uses left. Laptop 15 degrees off. Parallel with desk edge. Story 2. Fine ring of reddish-brown river-bottom soil around shower drain. Narrator had not used the shower. Story 2. Keycard log shows second room entry at 4:55 p.m. Narrator was on the river by 2:45 p.m. Story 2. Parking lot camera shows unidentified figure inside room 4 for exactly 13 minutes at 4:51 to 5:04 p.m. Story 3. Attendant says room 7 is already paid for to sole customer who is not checking in. Story 3. Attendant explains, I thought you were with them, and indicates the back of the parking lot. Story 3. 2 cars at tree line, 1 engine running with visible exhaust throughout. Occupants visible watching narrator leave. Story 3. Attendant asks, You heading north. As narrator exits. Narrator had not stated her direction or destination at any point. Story 3. No record of motel or rooms for rent at that gas station address. Room 7 has no traceable referent.